All right. Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Southern Plains Climate Science webinar series. I am your host, Cody Nguyen from the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Today's highlighted project is one of 7 from the 2021 to 2023 Future of Fires cohort of the Climate Adaptation Postdoctoral Fellows, or CAP Fellows program. Each of these projects explore regional differences in climate fire dynamics across the country. Our guest, Dr. Aaron Russell, is the CAP Fellow for the South Central CASC and is housed in the Natural Resources, Ecology, and Management Department at Oklahoma State University. His research focuses on the social science of natural resource management, in particular, how resources and knowledge can flow through actor networks to facilitate adaptation and collective action. He is going to share with us his comparative analysis of social capital within prescribed burn networks. Welcome, Dr. Russell.
Thanks so much, Cody, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see the people that are here, and I know some of you and I don't know others, so hopefully we get to know each other pretty well and you guys learned something from me and we all have a little bit of fun this morning. Let me go ahead and get my presentation shared. All right, so yeah, I'm calling this project Over the Hills and Through the Woods, Social Capital and Prescribed Burn Networks. And again, thanks very much, Cody, for the excellent introduction. It saves me a little breath on introducing the South Central CASC and the CAP Fellows program. I do want to indicate my other PI from Oklahoma State University is Omkar Joshi, and my co-author and really my prescribed burn mentor is John Weir, who's also at Oklahoma State University as an extension specialist. And yeah, just to touch again on the CAP-F fire program, we had 3 particular goals with this program. One was to look at the future of fire, another was to look at the future of adaptation to fire, and the third was to look at equitable incorporation of indigenous and other traditional ecological knowledge. And there's 7 of us postdocs representing various CASC regions. If you're not familiar with the CASC regions, I have an excellent image to show you of the CASC regions. So I'm in the South Central, and then we have representatives from 6 other regions. The Midwest and the Northeast were not represented in this cohort, but the rest of the regions, including Alaska and the Pacific Islands, each had a postdoc like myself who's working on a different aspect, including their regional work and then kind of a national level synthesis that we're all working on together. So really focusing in on this question, what is the future of fire? It's really looking at a continuing attention to shifts from historical baselines, really to deal with sort of management overruns in terms of the way that we manage our forests and our grasslands, as well as effects from climate change. This calls for approaches including new frameworks for management, things like resist accept direct frameworks and pods, if you're familiar with those. Just finding more ways to put good fire on the landscape using diverse knowledge. So in short, the future of fire is change, or even if we're able, some kind of paradigm shift to a better way of managing fire and taking advantage of fire use decisions from a more complex and integrative perspective. So really, the thing that we're doing with our national synthesis is we're looking at that fire use decision space. And this is sort of the draw and challenge of a national synthesis in fire, is how do we kind of look at the diversity of conditions and needs for the various CASC regions. This includes human interests around the wildland urban interface, managed forests, wilderness areas, range and ag land, timber resources, and culturally significant landscapes related to present and ancestral indigenous peoples. So can we efficiently describe the decision components in space for using fire in its many forms? So for our national synthesis, the CAP Fellows are trying to do that through coming up with kind of a conceptual model related to how decisions are made around fires. And so I'm kind of showing you a sample of that. This is not really what this presentation is about, but we're trying to kind of keep our regional work close to this conceptual model, just looking at motivations, ecological conditions, and capacity factors, which kind of come together to create a decision space around how can I use fire as efficiently as possible. And then we also have a second version of the figure that sort of takes that and places it onto a spatio-temporal kind of a scale so that you can see their interlocking decision triangles between single events and then longer term events. Oops. And really in that synthesis, just to kind of give you an idea of what we mean by synthesis, is research for scientific synthesis is the integration and assessment of knowledge and research findings pertinent to a particular issue with the aim of increasing the generality and applicability and access to those things. So really looking at integration, collaboration, co-management, rigorous science, and adequate support of firefighting, risk reduction, and other important fire uses, including cultural burn practices. Specific contexts that we're addressing at the national scale are wildfire use, as opposed to simply just wildfire suppression, prescribed burns, which is what the main focus of this presentation today is, cultural burn operations, fire suppression and avoidance when that's called for, and then looking at areas beyond the really scientifically dense, the literature dense aspects, which are Western forests, risk reduction, and cost benefit analysis. So here's where we get into my actual regional work, social network analysis of prescribed burning organizations. And so if you're here, you might be asking yourself, well, what type of research is this and why might you care? So as a social scientist, I like to say that to people that I am looking at the human dimensions of natural resources and other environmental issues. And the reason I do this is because humans are really one of the greatest complicating factors of natural resources and other environmental issues. They're really instrumental in why these issues are wicked, which are inherently resistant to clear definitions and easily identifiable predefined solutions. So pretty much everything that we mix people with as far as natural resource issues can be considered wicked. Social networks are groups of interrelated actors and are often analyzed according to the attributes of those actors as well as the connections between them. And social networks can provide you with insight into adaptive capacity within the networks and communities of practice. They can also give you insights into the availability of resources, capacity for collective decisions, the use of new knowledge, diversity and redundancy in systems, and equity of membership, and relation to local ecosystems. Organizational networks in particular provide opportunities to enhance adaptive capacity through collective action and learning, and they can link groups of stakeholders that are otherwise multi-scale, polycentric, and multi-level in their relationships. So what are prescribed fires? Let's just knock that definition out really quick as well. Prescribed fires are broadly defined as intentional ignitions, and they range from individuals who ignite fires with purposeful intent and open containment plans based on things like natural barriers, to highly organized complex operations with extensive documentation and precise containment objectives. They also occur in a lot of places across the country, so they can occur on all of these different kind of cultural and physical geographies, but often they contain common strategies and technologies. So then why do we need to focus on doing more social science research around prescribed fires? Well, there's sort of three different legs to that. The first is that there's a gap in fire science. A lot of the fire science and fire behavior and fire physics we come to rely on is based on risk reduction in wildfires. And so there's a bit of a gap when it comes to how fire behavior and fire science and fire risk relate to prescribed burning, which often happens at the opposite end of the year, or when the opposite physical conditions of wildfires. There's also a gap in the social science, which is what I focused on here. Basically, any prescribed fire research agenda, according to HERE's et al. 2020, must include clear and prominent considerations of the full range of ways social science could help improve our understanding of prescribed fire management practices. And then McCaffrey et al. 2012, who did a really big synthesis of kind of social science research around wildfire, says that looking at these intermediary organizations and social networks to help build community capacity for wildfire mitigation, and also assessing the role and contributions of local, state, and federal agencies in building and maintaining community capacity are really important questions that we still need to be looking at. So that kind of leads us into how are social networks structured around prescribed burning. But I'm going to take a moment to sort of take all of this sort of really high level gobbledygook social science language and kind of just sort of apply it to a more familiar to everyone who lives here in Oklahoma, at least, or in the Southern Plains situation. Here is the weather forecast office out of Norman's fire weather indications for tomorrow. This is not necessarily surprising if you're familiar with weather in Oklahoma in late March and April, but we have some extreme fire risk. And this is fairly, I would say, fairly accurate to most years. So if we look at last year, this is like a similar week from last year. We can see that every day of the week, and I've actually cut off the days, but every day of the week had extreme, near critical, or critical fire weather. So this is kind of an aspect of living with and having to make decisions around using fire here in Oklahoma. So when you kind of zoom out a little bit farther and you look at prescribed burning and risk, then we can start paying attention to what else was going on in 22. So wildfires, severe weather marking April of 2022, New Mexico wildfires, putting spotlights on the use of prescribed burns, those Hermit's Peak and Caps Canyon fires, which were escaped prescribed burns, handled by the Forest Service. And then eventually a statement of Forest Service Chief Randy Moore announcing a pause of prescribed fire operations for that prescribed fire season. Last year had a lot of fires, in particular, a lot of wildfire events. Very few were actually related to escaped prescribed burns, but the fact that some of the worst fires and the ones that got the most media attention were prescribed burns that had escaped kind of is a complicating factor because it creates a perceptual issue around burning. People can see in the media that this happened and all of a sudden they don't want to be near prescribed burns. They don't want to take part in them themselves. It kind of can introduce an aspect of fear, especially if you live in a wildland urban interface or you live in a particularly dry region like New Mexico. So let's zoom back over to my regional research again and look at what my research questions are. I looked at two in particular. In what ways do organizational networks of nonprofit prescribed burn practitioners differ between Oklahoma and North Carolina? And I use very specific language there, nonprofit prescribed burn practitioners, because I don't include any individual citizens that are private, and I also don't include any kind of like private for-profit organizations like burn contractors in this project. And the second question is, do the network structures suggest different interventions leading to more adaptive capacity and collective action outcomes? And I'll also have a little bit more information later about why I decided to look at Oklahoma and North Carolina. So let's talk about network structures. Networks, as I've mentioned, are made of actors and connections. In network science, actors are sometimes referred to as nodes. The connections between them can be referred to as vectors. And then certain things that we look at are like connection strengths, types, and directions. So if I'm connected to you, if you're connected to me, if that's something that we define as a strong connection or a weak connection, and then what kind of connection is that? Is that a I give you funding, you give me training, we work together, those kinds of connections. And then also kind of looking at subgroups and why groups have different sort of constructions around subjects. So what can network structures tell us about? Well, like I mentioned, they can give us a little bit of an indication of things like collective action and adaptive capacity. They can also give us some information about equity. If we see parts of the network that are cut off or have weak connections to the rest of the network, that might be indicative of an equity issue. Also resource flows. Where are the resources concentrated? Where are they not concentrated? And how do they get from point A to point B? And so the sort of social science that I'm using to look at these structures is based on the concept of social capital, which is really looking at the quality of groups and then the value of individual social relationships. So how does that relate to prescribed burning networks? You can think of it this way. Social capital is the quality of resources within the network and the connections through which they disperse. So specifically to get to social capital, we have to look at network closure and structural holes. And so network closure is essentially how densely connected the network is, how well connected the network is. If a network is really well connected, it has high network closure. If it's really loosely connected, it has low network closure. And so we look at that by looking at actual measures of density for the whole networks. And then we look at it through centralization, or sort of how star-shaped a network is, as well as how important specific individuals are within networks. The other aspect, structural holes. We look at structural holes, which are sort of holes in connections between different actors, or at least weak connections instead of strong connections. We can look at structural holes by looking at a concept called heterophily, which is how likely are you to connect with an actor in the network that has different attributes than you do. And also sort of an EI index, which is essentially a ratio of within subgroup connections to outside of subgroup connections. So really both of those just kind of tell you, do you have a connection to different types of organizations instead of just the same types of organizations? And to give you a little bit more information on the research design, I focused on North Carolina and Oklahoma networks. They're similar in that they have very strong and robust prescribed fire cultures already. They're different because of the different kind of cultural and physical geography. So for instance, here in Oklahoma, prescribed burning is often done in aid of rangeland and ag land maintenance, as well as invasive species removal. We have a lot of problems with the eastern red cedar, and prescribed fire can be one way of dealing with that in a cost-efficient way. In North Carolina, longleaf pine ecosystems are of particular importance and can be maintained through prescribed fire usage. Um, both states are kind of regionally representative in terms of their physical geography. So if you want to talk about the Southeast and kind of longleaf pine ecosystems, North Carolina's network is not a bad place to start. Similarly, if you want to look at the Southern Plains, or if you want to look at the cross timbers ecoregion, looking at Oklahoma is not a particularly bad place to start. In the data collection, I used focus groups followed by interviews and surveys, and then closed out just by kind of using web information. The focus groups were as many kind of prominent actors as I could get from state agencies and NGOs to start, and then kind of asking them, who are you connected to? How do you use fire? Can you suggest other people that I might talk to? And then essentially just snowballing out. So how do you know when you've reached enough people? How do you know when your network is complete? Well, there's a couple of different ways to do this. One is to make sure you're comfortable with the boundary you've set. So I set boundaries that were state borders, Oklahoma and North Carolina. That's not perfect though, because natural resource issues don't necessarily respect administrative boundaries. In fact, famously, they don't. The other way to know when your network is complete is when you sort of start getting saturated responses to who do you work with, who are the most important actors that you participate with in prescribed burning. And all of a sudden, after you've interviewed a certain amount, you start seeing the same names pop up over and over, and there's no new names that pop up. A simple way to think about this approach is that it's just triangulation. We're kind of using different modes of getting to different actors and eventually sort of arriving at the right spot. So an interesting aspect of social network analysis is that it has both qualitative and quantitative approaches to analysis. The quantitative approaches are all sort of based on matrix algebra and some more complex math that can give you sort of can give you kind of numbers and statistics around structural components in networks. But the qualitative version is a little bit more fun, because you can look at things and kind of pick out patterns just visually. So the way that social networks are organized is you put them into social network maps, and then I've been using something called non-metric multidimensional scaling, which moves nodes or actors, if you like, closer to each other if they have stronger connections to one another. And so you'll see that shortly, what that actually looks like. So by the numbers, I ended up doing 23 interviews after the focus groups. And then after everything was done and said, I had a 40 actor Oklahoma network and a 37 actor North Carolina network. And so you can kind of see the matrix that pops up. And I'm not going to break it down necessarily, but you can just see that you start off with sort of matrices of connections of people. And then from that, you can start to organize them around these different network functions. And luckily there's software that is very helpful in doing this. So you can kind of get an idea if a network is centralized, it's more star-shaped. If it's dense but not centralized, you can see that there are a lot of connections, but there's not really any indication of which actors might be the most important, other than just that they have more connections than others. There are fragmented subgroups, and then yeah, network closure just means that every actor is connected in one way or another. So let's actually look at a network map. This next map is the Oklahoma network that I've put together. And you can see it kind of looks like a messy tumbleweed, but just to give you an idea, I use a concept called degree centrality to change the size of each of the nodes. And so each of these nodes represents a different actor type based on color. So blue nodes are federal agencies, red nodes are NGOs, orange nodes are PBA or land associations, and then green nodes are state agencies. And so the larger the node, the more connections, and strong connections in particular, that actor has. And then if a connection from one actor to another was indicated as strong, it's blue and thicker arrow. And if it was weak, it's an orange and thinner arrow. And so right off the bat, you might notice some structures to pick out. One is just that there's this really kind of dense core. And that's a really important aspect of this. I'll get into sort of who those core actors are in a moment. I, of course, provided codes so that I didn't take up the whole network map space with labels of different actor names, which would make it really difficult to see anything. But we really do get this sort of core periphery structure, and I'll show it to you here, and then I'll actually show it to you as well in the North Carolina network. Another thing to notice is that I have indicated here that Oklahoma tribes are part of the network. And this is an interesting way to do this because obviously Oklahoma tribes cannot or should not necessarily be aggregated under just one node. But that's an aspect of this project that will need to be expanded in a really collaborative manner with tribes in the state. So at the moment, I had to make the decision between, well, do I want to include them in the network or not? I didn't actually do any outreach with Oklahoma tribes, but they were indicated by actors, the rest of the actors in the network in some instances. So I did want to include at least one node to indicate that there's a part of the network there that's incomplete. Another is on the right, that N2 and F4 location essentially is pointing to an area where there might be like a bit of a geographic subgroup based on the work of the Nature Conservancy. I can actually tell you that that's what that N2 node is the Nature Conservancy. So for the Oklahoma network, those core actors are represented by the Oklahoma Prescribed Burn Association, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, Oklahoma State University Extension, the Partners Program at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Natural Resources Conservation Service through USDA, and one or two really well-connected local PBAs. The peripheral actors to that core are mostly local PBAs and land management organizations. So these are the actual like county level or simply regional, like local region prescribed burn associations. And I already mentioned Oklahoma tribes and the Nature Conservancy and State Forestry as representative of kind of regional subgroups as part of the states where they're connected mostly because they happen to be in the same area or are dealing with the same kind of landscape type. So here's the North Carolina network. And again, you can notice right away that there's sort of a core central group of actors. Interestingly, in this network, that N1 node, that huge node that's a big center star, is the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council. And the reason that they're pulled a little bit to the right and outside of the core is because they have a lot of connections to NGOs that I wasn't able to determine were connected well to each other. So really what happens is with the non-metric multidimensional scaling, that just sort of pulls that node out to the right a little bit, but I would still consider them to be a strong part of the core and really well connected within. And there's also some other sort of subgroups that I think are regionally geographically located. I did a similar node indicating North Carolina tribes as I did with Oklahoma tribes. And let's take a look at what that actually looks like in list form. So core actors, again, very similar to Oklahoma, the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council, the Southern Fire Exchange was one, the Nature Conservancy, the Longleaf Alliance, the National Park Service, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and North Carolina state agencies. Again, peripheral actors were local PBAs and NGOs. One really important difference between the North Carolina and Oklahoma networks happens to be that there are many more active local prescribed burn associations in Oklahoma than there are in North Carolina. That's not to say that there are not as many prescribed burning organizations, but just that the ones in Oklahoma are often directly focused on prescribed burning, while many in North Carolina are doing prescribed burning, but the mission of their organization is based around a broader kind of subset of activities, land management or other NGO focus. All right, and then another thing that I wanted to do with this research was I wanted to compare the two networks broadly. So instead of just comparing individual actors within the networks, looking at the networks themselves. And to do this, we look at density, centralization, and that EI index. So essentially density is just how many connections are there within the network. Centralization is how star-shaped the networks are. And the EI index is which of the networks is more heterophilous or more connected to actors with different attributes than the other. And an interesting thing is that the two networks are actually very similar in terms of density and centralization scores. There's no statistically significant difference that I could find between the two. Whether or not that density and centralization score is low or high compared to other state networks is a really good question for future research. If you add more and more actors to a network, the density tends to go down. So it's sort of this inverse relationship. The more actors you have within a network, the lower the density can be, unless they're all extremely well connected to each other, which doesn't seem to be the case. One thing that did pop out as a difference was that the Oklahoma network does appear to show more heterophily through the EI index than the North Carolina network does. And so that's an interesting kind of an aspect that came out of this. So as we jump into sort of discussions about this topic, again, that core periphery structure is really prominent in looking at these networks. And I think that one of the most important things we can draw from that is that there's a division of resources and labor. The core of the networks is really representative of the funding and expertise base, while the fires that are being set are often done so by those who are working in the peripheral organizations, be they PBAs or other NGO type organizations. So what does that mean? You know, how can we sort of draw interesting conclusions from that? One of the ways that we might think about that is that the core networks represent the long-term viewpoint, and the peripheral structures represent the more local and day-to-day concerns. So making sure that those connections exist between the periphery and that the periphery is represented by and well connected to the core is an important, I think, possible improvement or network intervention that might improve kind of adaptive capacity and collective action in these networks. And so really focusing on that temporal and spatial scale is important. As I said, some of the groupings seem to be geographically important. That would make sense. And another aspect of this to think about is how these networks change over time. I think that if you are associated with a PBA or with any kind of professional organization, you might be familiar with the difficulty of keeping that organization running from one year to the next and making sure people are invested, and are coming to meetings and are kind of taking advantage. So I would say that there is definitely a long-term aspect of this, which is how much do these networks fluctuate over time? An important question is this indicative of an effective network? It's hard to say. I think both Oklahoma and North Carolina represent strong prescribed burn cultures, and they have these really awesome central organizations. The Oklahoma Prescribed Burn Association and the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council are both very engaged and active and involved. And so these organizations or these networks might be representative of a model that could be applied in other places where prescribed burn organizations and networks are not as active. But there's also room to potentially have improvements. So some limitations that I've already touched on a little bit in this, but I'm going to expand on a little bit now. There are definitely uncontacted actors in this study. Private business entities are probably a really important aspect of this. I did want to keep it nonprofit in this first round of research, but looking at contractors, landscaping companies, et cetera, who might also be involved in prescribed burning might really change the way that these networks look, and they might provide a really important sort of connection between the core and the periphery. As well, tribal communities and entities are going to likely be a really significant difference within the network. And I think that that's something that really I would want to touch on and in a collaborative fashion find a way, or at least kind of leave part of this project in a way that someone else could pick it up and take it on and really look at how those networks are connected, if they're separate or how they interact. It is, again, a comparison of two similar cases. I was really hoping to see a lot more difference between Oklahoma and North Carolina, simply because that would be a really interesting, that would make the story a little bit more interesting, but they seem to be somewhat similar in a few regards. So it might be interesting to do more case studies. And then another is just simply the reliance on about one actor per organization. I tried to find in my outreach to these organizations the most kind of senior, prominent prescribed burn actor or practitioner. And that can really introduce a level of subjectivity into the responses you get. I don't think that that really causes a big problem in the results, but it is something to think about, that if you were to ask multiple people within the same organization, you might get different responses, and thus the networks might look different. And just again, to touch on Indigenous communities, it's an aspect of the project that's deficient, and that's one that definitely I would want to improve. The network absolutely contains actors and connections to burning by tribal entities and communities, and I've aggregated them under those single nodes again in each network, just to suggest that they are important and that part of the project should go forward. And just to kind of give you an idea of that using maps, if you were to overlay the wildfire hazard in Oklahoma with the tribal jurisdictional areas and also the kind of county prescribed burn associations, you can see that there are some of the nations who have plenty of prescribed burn organization potential or representation to deal with specific wildfire risk, but some don't. In particular, the Choctaw, there seems to be higher wildfire risk, but less PBA activity. So an interesting potential future question there. Additional ways to expand the project. I'm really only looking at one attribute in this project, and that's actor type. So are you a state agency? Are you a federal agency? Are you an NGO? But there are specific roles that were also captured in the surveys and the interviews that I did. So are you participating in risk reduction? Are you more focused on ecosystem maintenance, offsite support, networking, on the ground support? And really what that can do is it can give you an idea of what other sorts of attributes might provide interesting groupings to go along with these networks. And also looking at the types of networks. So are you providing risk avoidance assistance? Are you providing education assistance? Are you providing equipment assistance? What are the types of connections between different actors? This is going to be an interesting future aspect of this project, and one that I, in the time remaining to my postdoctoral fellowship, that I might actually be able to accomplish. So how can this information be used? As I discussed, it can connect workforces to long-term planning and funding by looking at that kind of division of labor. These networks might be used as templates for other locations, specifically other locations within the region. If somebody really came and explored the Oklahoma or North Carolina networks and thought, wow, these people are really getting fire done. They might be able to kind of look at the connections here and say, okay, well, it's these specific types of actors who are looking at the funding, and it's these specific types of actors who are really doing the work. And it can also be used to improve representation and interconnection of peripheral actors for stronger decision making. So some sort of broad conclusions. Prescribed fire organizations and other fire learning networks are instrumental. It's really important, especially in parts of the country where lands are mostly owned privately. Those local PBAs are the best bet for getting people a little bit of knowledge about setting up a burn plan and doing a burn safely. And if you're a member of a PBA, you can often, as long as you've got a burn plan, at least here in Oklahoma, you can sometimes burn on a red flag day when other people couldn't. So it's sort of expanding those weather windows in which you can safely burn. Local PBAs and other local land cooperatives are peripheral in nature. That's what we're finding. And they're not well interconnected with each other, but they do generally have access to various other actors through these statewide burn councils and government agencies. And because we can show which actors exist in the core, peripheral actors can seek out new connections beyond those that they might already have. So if a peripheral actor is not being served by the connection that they have either to just the PBA or the Oklahoma Prescribed Burn Association or a specific state or federal agency, they now might have an indication of others that they might reach out to. And that's pretty much it. I do want to give some thanks and acknowledgements to the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, who's funded my postdoc, my host university, my PI, Dr. Joshi, my co-author and prescribed burn mentor, John Weirigan, various focus group members from Oklahoma and North Carolina, and then members of the North Carolina State Extension Service, who I relied on heavily in the initial planning of this project. And some references for those who maybe get a hold of the presentation later, but otherwise that's generally it. Thank you.